Hello, everybody. See a few folks starting to come in. We'll give it a few more seconds before we start today's webinar. Thank you guys for joining us today. Hello, all. Thank you guys for joining. We'll give it a few more seconds before we get started. Happy Thursday to everyone around the world joining us live for today's webinar. I'll turn off my fan. You might hear that here on the mic. All right, how will we get started now? We do have a lot of things to cover, but we just want to welcome you guys in for our first VMware Tanzu webinar in the new webinar system here on GoToWebinar. Today we'll be talking about 5 AI ML problems you will have to solve, and I'd like to bring in some amazing speakers. Before I do, if you guys have any questions, if there's anything you guys would like to ask during the presentation, please feel free to use the questions tab below or the chat function. We'll do our best to monitor all the questions coming in, and we'll answer them live on today's event. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. We have Jonathan and we have Acacia. So let me bring them in via webcam. Hey, Jonathan, how you doing? Hey, Acacia, how you doing?
Hello. Good. How are you?
All right. Without further ado, let's hand this off to today's speakers. Up to you guys.
Okay. All right. Hi, welcome. My name is Jonathan. I'm a delivery lead with VMware Tanzu Labs. We're here to talk about some AI ML topics in the sort of safety and hazard space. This is an area that I've been interested in for a long time. My original career was in data journalism, so I was very interested in telling stories from flowing data, trying to understand the world and do useful stuff off of that. And then that's kind of turned into this career in mostly building applications with data science underneath them. And Acacia, you want to say a few words?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Acacia Thomas Baker. My background is initially in marketing, but I've been working as a product designer for over 7 years now, and I'm really excited to have you guys here today to talk to you guys about some of the work that Jonathan and I have been discovering.
Yeah, so this will be pretty informal. We're gonna go back and forth a little bit. There's two approaches to webinars like this. You can either have like the 3 things you wanna say and it's very tight and very controlled and on message, or you can just chuck everything in there and like we're gonna have a conversation. And we're doing the second version. So there's gonna be a lot of stuff here. We may not get all of it. And we wanna level set with your questions. So we're gonna stop a couple of times and ask questions after we set up a topic. Some of the material is going to be very intro level, but what we're finding is that despite lots and lots of reporting and energy and interest in this topic, the mental models are all over the place. And so we want to get people aligned on terms and some of the base concepts. And then on top of that, we're going to try to answer your questions and have a conversation based on our experience building prototypes for organizations in public sector, healthcare, places that Tanzu Labs works, where we're trying to incorporate machine learning into product design. All right, so I think I'm gonna kick us off with a couple of base concepts. AI is a cultural construct. If we were trying to define this, it's not a very technical definition. The things that get labeled AI are basically software that is new and confusing and a little bit scary. And then as soon as it becomes conventional, it stops being AI and it starts being a specific kind of software. Yahoo Maps used to be considered AI because routing from place to place, it was all just kind of this magical stuff. Now we use it frequently, maybe every time you get in a car, and it is no longer magic. So lots of things currently are getting wrapped into this AI cultural construct. What we're going to try to do today is unpack that a little bit so that we can have conversations about the actual technologies underneath those. Machine learning is a specific flavor of technology that is under pretty much all of the AI conversations today. And it's got some specific behaviors and failure modes that we should be aware of. And so we're going to talk mostly about machine learning. This is the AI conversation, but we're getting into the weeds a little bit of let's talk about a specific technology. Acacia, anything to add?
Nope, covered there.
Cool. All right, so let's define machine learning. Machine learning, unlike AI, cultural construct, machine learning has like a specific definition. It is essentially a pattern of technology where we define a problem, we clean up some data, and we train a model. A model is a computer program that can take information from the world and it can make some judgments about it. So once we have that model, we can then build it into software. The key there is that training a model is resource intensive, sometimes very resource intensive in the case of language models. But then once it exists, it's much smaller and it operates much more like a computer program, like a compiled binary that you can install somewhere and run. So as software teams and software people, we're going to be operating near these models all the time. And this is the future. Old world, we had apps with a data layer. Now we have apps with a data layer, and we're also probably calling a model, and we're giving it some sort of prompt, and then we're getting a response back. Okay, models come in different flavors. Large language models like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, whichever your favorite is this week, are one thing that's getting lots of hype, but there's other models. And so some of the things we're going to talk about are specific to all machine learning. Some of the things are going to be specific to things like large language models, and it's helpful to understand which is which. All right, this brings us to our 5 things that we will have to solve. The approach today is going to be to give you some like vignettes about each of these topics. We are not going to drain the bucket on how to do privacy on the internet. What we're going to try to do instead is kick these things off, start a conversation with the goal being that when you're done, you're going to have some intuition that when you run into problems shaped like this, you're going to say, oh, okay, this is a problem I have to solve. And that we should stop at the front end of our AI product development journey and try to address this and figure out how we're going to design in appropriate safeguards to what we're building. Keisha, take it away.
Yeah, so we're going to start off by talking about the issue of privacy, which obviously is a big concern of lots of folks when it comes to AI and models. Jonathan, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So what you're seeing here is there's the opportunity for you to have a local model, which means you have more control over where your data is going and you understand how it's being utilized, and it's a bit safer in terms of privacy and protecting that of your users, as opposed to if you're working with a model that's much further away and is more so like an open AI model where you're unsure of what's happening in terms of where your data is going, how it's being utilized, is it being misused, did they accidentally send it to the wrong folks, and things of that nature. So there's a lot of benefits to keeping it local and closer to home in terms of being able to manipulate and keep your information safe from a privacy perspective. But it's very tempting, and usually what a lot of folks are drawn toward is going toward a ChatGPT or something that's much further distant away. But the trade-off there is definitely how much control you have in terms of managing what your privacy looks like. Anything to add there, Jonathan? You're muted. Okay. And okay, great. And so what you're seeing here on this slide are some patterns that we've noticed in terms of how you might want to go about layering your defense. So if you're thinking about what the users are inputting, some ways in which you can think about this from a privacy perspective are doing implementing some things such as masking or input screens. And the pattern with regards to like observing while in flight. So let's say that you're concerned about the privacy while you know, the users are actually engaging with the products. API gateways are a great way to mitigate that, and that gives you an opportunity to control how the information is actually going in and out, and logging in and content safety as well with regards to observing for in-flight. And you want to also think about like who it is that you're talking to, right? So being mindful of the audience and what information you're sharing with them. Again, this goes to a local versus a commercial API, right? So when it's close to home, when the model is closer, there's a lot more opportunities to protect and keep the privacy of the data safe, as opposed to when it's further away and you have less control over how that data is being manipulated, whose hands it's in, even just knowing the folks who are actually overseeing your data, the data of your users, for example. And then we also have observe outputs and iterate, right? So this one is around being able to secure. It's like in terms of reviewing the mechanisms and thinking about things such as automated testing and measuring your change over time, right? So observing the differences in terms of what did it look like the first time we put this in versus the second time? How can we iterate on this to improve from a privacy and safety perspective? Anything to add on this one, Jonathan?
Yeah, you mentioned input masking. Can you talk a little bit about what that pattern looks like and what that can provide for you?
Yeah, so masking is definitely something that I think a lot of folks should take advantage of in terms of making sure that like the information that you're putting in might look one way, and then with the mask, it allows you to basically manipulate in some ways what the data actually looks like on the other side. And I think that this is a great opportunity for folks to be able to kind of control a little bit more of what is being seen on the other side of from the information that you're outputting.
Yeah, so like an example would be if we've got a prompt going into a large language model, and that prompt includes things like a social security number. We can then at the front end of that interaction, notice that that's a social security number and swap in the word user social security number in little brackets and then pass that to the model. When that comes back, we can then swap it back. And so like it's this way of basically keeping the local information under the covers from the external vendor in OpenAI or Google or whoever. Challenge there is, Keisha, those systems always work perfectly, right?
Absolutely, Jonathan.
No way that could go wrong. So yeah, keep going.
Yeah, I think one thing too on that front though is like it's a great start, right? Like it might not be perfect like most things in the AI space right now, but just in terms of the safety or of protecting PII of your users or folks being able to at least initially put in the word social security to stick with your example versus even just the last four of someone's social security number feels a lot safer, especially in the hands of this giant behemoth of like a ChatGPT or what have you. Like you just don't know what could happen there. So implementing a technique such as masking can definitely just help you to feel safer in terms of, or sleep better at night in terms of just thinking about how is that data being manipulated, whose hands is it in.
Yeah, and I think there's a design pattern here that we should call out, which is some of these things are inherently bad ideas, right? Like, so we've got all of these defenses of like, we're gonna have these technical countermeasures to protect privacy and enforce policies and these sorts of things. But we know those are an emerging space. We know that they're gonna break. So us as product designers, as product creators, should be thinking critically about, is this a space that is safe to operate for a vulnerable population or for a particular class of data, health information, immigration information, all these like classes of things that we know are difficult to touch. We want to start being proactive about that and be looking for opportunities to provide value from these systems with limited risk exposure, right? Because all these countermeasures we will get better at as an industry over time. But right now it's a leaky bucket. Right. All right. Pausing for questions. Do we have any from the field?
Yes. So there's a question here about the topic of having local models. Is this something that kind of mitigates privacy issues for you? Is this something that kind of you just implement this and you're good to go? Is there any reason to implement some of the techniques you mentioned when you're leveraging a local model?
Yeah, so the distinction here is between like a commercial model, meaning an API that you pay money for, and we'll talk about this a little bit more a few slides down, but you can basically send all of your data over to ChatGPT or whoever. There's a middle space where you're running your own instance of a model, but on the cloud of your choice. So like Azure offers this, AWS can offer this. And then there's like fully things under your control inside of your cloud partition or like actually on-prem. In those scenarios, you can apply access controls along all the normal rules that you would do with your own organization. Once you send stuff to OpenAI, you are trusting them to not do bad things. And there have been mistakes already from things like OpenAI had a middleware that was routing outputs from ChatGTP to the wrong people. So somebody was passing in, let's say, here's a prompt with a bunch of scheduling information, and that goes to somebody else. Not great. These are things that we would like to see like be structurally impossible, right? And having local control is a way to do that. There's also some other benefits to that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Keisha, anything you want to add?
No, I think you covered that. It's definitely, again, it's scary to think that that can happen, but it does happen, and we have seen different instances of this in the news. And so, again, locally just gives you a bit more control and an understanding of whose hands the data is in and how it's being utilized.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about accuracy. I'll drive this section. Let's talk about language models for a bit. Okay, ChatGTP, massive cultural moment, more so than other forms of machine learning. Computer vision had like massive breakthroughs over the last 15 years that did not really hit as hard culturally because you can't use it at home, or at least not in the same way that interacting with a language model can. Language models are also a little bit deceptive because they can mimic high-level reasoning very well. And people are starting to realize that that's not always what you're actually dealing with. So let's talk about language models for a minute. Machine learning, define a problem, clean your data, train that model to do something, and then run something. In the language model concept, here's a story of myself messing with language. About 10 years ago, I decided I wanted to make Pride and Prejudice and the D&D Monsters Manual into the same book. This was a project that other people online were using. Put these things in my laptop, had a plain text file. It basically mulched these things together into a probability model. So it is a truth universally acknowledged, or maybe it's not a truth, maybe it's something else. And you can kind of basically branch off of these sentences and create these sort of chaotic, interesting kinds of things. So these two books, when put together, give you about 500,000 parameters. So I can run that on my laptop and just kind of grind through it all. It takes a few seconds. What's happened recently is that we've become, as an industry, very, very efficient about building these parameter sets. So now we have parameter models or large language models with something like 100 trillion parameters. As a result, we get much more sophisticated outputs that are starting to approach things that feel very smart. Whether they are smart or not, the industry is still kind of figuring out. And kind of what we're seeing is that in some ways, they're extremely smart, very good at mimicking language, translations, making huge steps forward. Semantic understanding of how words fit into sentences is wildly more advanced than it was 10 years ago. But that frontier of what is smart and what isn't is extremely jagged. And there's going to be pockets where it falls over and does really dumb things. And it's hard to predict where exactly you're going to land, which is where a lot of folks interacting with language models are getting into trouble. The other thing is that, like, we didn't really define a problem. We don't really know what we're running. So like these things are just getting shotgunned out into the world with the hope that the world figures out what to do with them. And that's what we're seeing right now. And we're seeing folks make big, big mistakes on high profile stages. Google is one of those. Google's very concerned about search, the thing that provides 85% of their revenue, becoming much less relevant and people interacting with the language model itself as a knowledge base. That's bad for Google. So they are full speed ahead on bringing out the next thing. They're making some bad mistakes. All right, so just to review, language models are one flavor of machine learning, right? It's a model you're going to call. Very big to train. Once it's operating, it's smaller, not totally small, but smaller. And I want to talk about a pattern called RAG, Retrieval Augmented Generation. This is where accuracy is really going to become interesting. RAG is the pattern that you're going to see in 2024 in businesses being used. Pretty much all AI applications in business are this pattern. customer service agent gets a request. They're about to write a response to that, but they know that this thing has been answered like 500 times before, and all of that is things that the business knows. Can we click a button that says autocomplete based on the previous 500 answers to the exact same question? And that looks a little bit like this. Help Desk app calls a small app that just does the autocomplete piece. It asks for a response from a database, and then it takes that response, which is basically the previous chat logs, and it stuffs it into a prompt. The large language model is not really aware of your data, except that you're prompting in a couple hundred words of stuff. You can prompt in tens of thousands of words, but computationally it gets very, very expensive. So the search piece of this becomes pretty important, and the ability to chunk that source data into the most relevant things and then hand that off to the language model cleanly becomes very important. Now, on the other side, you get responses that might include exactly what you need. So if it's things like, here's a list of where everybody on my team is currently based on their calendars, you can ask it questions like, who's in New York this week? That is business useful. It is a pretty good interface for that kind of stuff. And if you've got structured data or somewhat structured data on things like people's calendars, you can take all that JSON, throw it at the language model, and there's a pretty good chance it can read through that and figure it out. All right. Here's what's going on in RAG LLM. The stuff in blue is the new AI stuff. All of the other parts are software development. And what we're seeing in a lot of organizations is the data science teams are spinning up RAG demos that are getting interesting, compelling results. But all of the other pieces of this product development flow are really underbaked. And so they're getting compelling demos, but they're not actually getting to prod. And that's because, like, cool, you need a user. You need a business problem to solve. You need like all of these evaluation steps to figure out if we're really solving that problem. Acacia, we've done a bit of this. Do you have, tell me a little bit about like the discovery process in like, at what point should we start talking about solutions versus problems?
It's a good question. I hate to say it depends, but it does. But when we
Designer answer.
Some of the previous examples that we worked on, I think it's really important that you understand the problem space and think through, where does AI really need to help here, and like what is still going to be like a bespoke specific answer that the RAG LLM model might need to get trained on. I think that when there's some things that are just like, as you mentioned, just very, very much like standardized or been being asked a ton of times, it's definitely a good time to think about from an efficiency perspective. Let's bring in RAG to help us out here. But when there's opportunities for there to be large variances in the answers based on how it's asked or who's asking it, I think that is really important to spend some time in discovery and exploring to make sure we have a better understanding of just what it is that the output is actually going to offer to help ensure that it's as accurate as possible.
Yeah. Cool. One more thing to call out here is that the base models that are being provided to the world, right? That part where we just train off the entire internet and then chuck it out there. That training off the entire internet is like a couple of months old at best, sometimes years old. So we might want to stuff documents about our current business context into the prompts. That's RAG. Another approach is to take a model and start tuning it to your own specific use cases. What we're seeing, and this is kind of an unexpected but interesting development, is that the massive large language models being put out by OpenAI and other folks are not the best way to solve problems for two reasons. One, the training to the local domain is giving you significant advantages in terms of accuracy and responding in the ways that you like. The other is that those smaller trained models are much cheaper to operate than the really big heavy LLMs. So you see people deliberately using smaller, cheaper, scalable models that are adapted to their particular domain space, things that a commercial API kind of get at, but like don't really do as well as a proper overtraining. And that's, I think, where we're going to see a lot of energy going in. You are getting out of product development and into data science stuff, right? You need actual data science people who are good at this. So it's going to stretch your team a little bit if you don't have dedicated data science people. But I think we're going to see that become a standing resource for a lot of organizations. Okay, let's talk about accuracy. This is a paper that I read about yesterday. So this is the kitchen sink. We're just chucking everything in. There's a lot of benchmarks for LLMs, and they change all the time, and like you should be aware of them and using them. This is a new one put out by Meta, the comprehensive RAG accuracy thing. CRAG is the acronym they're using for it. I think the main thing is best in class is wrong 25% of the time. So getting back to let's make good product design decisions on the front end. It's going to be wrong 25% of the time. We have to figure out as designers how to get value out of these systems, knowing that it's only going to give you a good answer 3 out of 4 times at best. These are like the frontier best models out there. There are situations where that's totally appropriate, and there are situations where that gets everybody fired. And you want to design that in on the front end with the expectation that we're at 75% today. We might be at 85% next year. We're not going to be at 99. We're not going to be at 100. The last mile on accuracy is going to remain hard for a long time. Questions? Who's got thorny business problems they're okay talking about?
Yeah, I've got a question here, and it sort of relates to what you were just talking about there at the end, and it's more related to the kind of product development side of things. So it's like, if you're working on a new feature that leverages a large language model, how do you decide when accuracy is an issue? And do you have any tips for testing a new feature where accuracy is going to be important?
Yeah, I think automated testing is a big deal. Akeisha, jump in if you want to add anything. I think automated testing is a big deal, and having benchmarks. I mentioned there's like sort of general purpose benchmarks. You should also be defining your use cases and test cases in your organization. And that should be a stack of things that you're testing against. And the reason you want to do that in a like sort of automated and ongoing way is because accuracy is going to drift over time. And so you're going to want to be able to say like, okay, this is what our model is doing this week, and then go back and look at what your model was doing 2 weeks ago. And being able to plot that is going to be really powerful. I think the intuition about whether like how good is good enough is going to be like this design challenge of most of the applications that are getting shipped right now are going to employees, not the public. Like that's step one, right? These are people that want to make it work as opposed to people who want to break it. Google did not do this. Google slapped a RAG-ish implementation of the entire internet onto their search results a couple of weeks ago and had to walk it back pretty spectacularly because it was full of data that they didn't really understand. But also there was like millions of people using it adversarially, that they were going in and saying, let's see what the worst thing in here is. Employees using like stuff to do their job generally don't do that. They avoid the things that are known to be bad, right? So like that in itself is like great. Like understand like the context you're deploying into and start to make good decisions up front with the expectation that accuracy is not going to be perfect.
Yeah, and I'd also add like assess the risk of getting it wrong, right? Like how dangerous is it if the output is incorrect, right? Like is this going to like impact the company? Is it going to cause the company to lose money, or is it just like, oh, this is a small thing we can go around, we can go back and fix it, right? Or can we iterate on this? That answer was slightly correct. It's just not telling, it's omitting some information or what have you. Like, definitely think about what is the risk and the cost of your output being inaccurate, because it's not going to look the same in every industry or at every company. But I think that like that's also something that everyone should be assessing prior to just putting information out there into the world. So.
Yeah. Cool. All right, we are clipping along. I'm going to fly through this next section, and we're going to try to hit all 5 of these in our remaining 15 minutes. This is Becky Clunan. She's an illustrator. She does some really interesting stuff, and specifically like has this sort of body of work that sort of has a lot of interesting things to say about like what emotions, particularly like women, are allowed to have, and like it's just really good stuff. This is a person selling mid-journey prompts in the style of Becky Clunan, and they superficially resemble her stuff. There's a woman looking over her left shoulder, there's a bunch of skulls, and it's red. What it doesn't have is anything interesting to say about the role of women in society. All of that's gone, right? This is a sort of walking zombie simulacrum of an artistic idea. It's also directly competitive with her commercially. And someone is selling this with her name on it. She gets $0. Okay, so artists' responses to this are not positive. This was a part of a protest on a platform called ArtStation, maybe it was DeviantArt, one of them. There were thousands of these. We cropped most of them out because some of them were quite rude and had butts in them. But the reaction was very strong. That's not the biggest problem for AI image generators. This is the biggest problem for AI image generators, because the Walt Disney Company also has some things to say about intellectual property. So let's look at Midjourney. Is a generator. It's one of the more stylish ones. Here's a prompt: Lisa Frank, Kawaii, Star Wars Mandalorian helmet fashion show, aspect ratio 9:16, quality 2, model Ninja 5, seed 750. Okay, so there's this like kind of control language going in, created by someone named Silent Rajex. I don't know anything about them. Don't look for them. Into a model run by Midjourney. Let's think about what owns what here. That prompt text is apparently not a creative output in the eyes of the law. The actual output image is not copyrightable because it's made by a machine. The term Star Wars Mandalorian, Emmy-winning TV show, is a trademark. The Mandalorian is a character that is owned by Disney. And Midjourney collects $20 a month to run this engine. I don't know where this is going to land legally, but like there's two things. One, you're messing with a large, powerful company with embedded interests in not having Mandalorian helmets with what appears to be a sex toy on the top of it. Two, you've pissed off lots of artists who can create cultural capital for fun. You could probably get away with one of those. Both of those is not a good idea. Here's my preview of the upcoming legal fight. There's a legal analysis about fair use and like the current precedents and all of that. The other thing is the power analysis of Disney backed by thousands of angry artists. Where I'm going with this is that this is a area that would have benefited from a different path if you are Midjourney Inc., the company. They could have gone down the path of revenue share. They could have gone down the path of lots of different options. There were bailouts from this. But now they're in a real weird spot. And companies like Adobe are like, you know what? I want to get some of that. And they're going headlong into this. Adobe could have done things like Photoshop now lets you rotate an object by 20 degrees and it looks perfect. And like that probably would not have gone into questions about plagiarism versus copyright theft. There is a lack of concern for who was being impacted that is now directly relevant to those businesses. And so my suggestion is ethics is a topic that businesses need to get much smarter about, and they need to start thinking about the impacts of their products and incorporating that into their next steps. There's a bunch of stuff here that, so I just talked about image generation. It's one where that's, I think, a little clear cut, and because that stuff launched like 2 or 3 years ago, it's a little farther along. Language models are a different technology. The case for like transformative use with like ChatGPT versus like an image generator, they're not the same thing. And I want us to like think about them as separate technologies. But I want us to be aware that like these issues are not going to go away, and people are going to have real questions about what is owed to the people who create source material, who's allowed to access it, what uses are and aren't allowed. There's a bunch in there. Keisha, anything you want to add? Okay. Any questions from the field on this one?
Sorry, I was muted. I did have one thing I wanted to add. I think it's a missed opportunity, I'd say, for companies not to be considering ethical concerns of what they're creating. And I think a lot of people think because there's no specific legalese or like, rule of thumb around it, that they can get away with it. But I don't think that's always going to be the case. And so I highly encourage anyone who's looking to build out any type of model or utilize AI to take ethics very seriously earlier on, because it'll save you a lot of trouble down the line.
Yeah, you made a really good point though, which is that like what's legal and what's socially acceptable are not always the same thing. And the law tends to move towards what is considered socially acceptable.
Right, yep.
And the wholesale replication of like artists' distinctive style, 100% legal. It is plagiarism, which is not a crime.
Right.
And so that misalignment between what people think is fair and good and what the law allows is probably going to mean that the law is a moving target.
Mm-hmm.
And there's going to be companies that are doing it right, and they're going to be fine. And the companies that do not care about these issues might end up on the wrong side and not have a business.
Yeah, definitely something I think folks need to take a bit more serious.
Yeah. All right, costs. Let's talk about money. Okay, we've got 2 forms of models, local models and commercial models. There's a bunch of implications about these choices, but one of them is just raw money. When you call OpenAI, it's pretty expensive. It is possible to stuff so many parameters into your prompt that they will charge you $90 per call to talk to ChatGPT 4 point, whichever one we're up to. So the cost curve looks a little bit like this. When you are first starting off, you're making a handful of calls in a testing context. ChatGPT gets you started very quickly. Makes a lot of sense to start there. Meanwhile, if you're going to run an open model, you need a bunch of infrastructure. You need to talk to companies like VMware. Hi, that's us. And we can help you manage those workloads. But you're probably going to want a little bit of tooling around it to provision that model in a way that is performant and cost effective long term. The interesting thing is what happens when we scale. Is that the infrastructure you stood up to run your open license model, you will eventually hit like usage, like saturation, but like that infrastructure upfront cost is pretty flat, whereas ChatGPT is perfectly linear to the number of calls. So if you get a product that takes fire, you need to be pretty careful that the math is still going to work at large scale. Meanwhile, those open license models, smaller, able to be fine-tuned to your organization, privacy's baked in. There's a bunch of things about that become a little bit more like routine software and less like a relationship to a abusive company that may not have your best interests. I say abusive in the sense that we don't know what the future looks like, but we know that OpenAI is not profitable. And I know that companies that have to turn towards profitability generally don't get better for their customers. So like that's out there. All right, hot take, spicy. Any questions about the cost stuff? Should we keep going?
I think you're good to keep going, yeah.
All right, let's talk about stability. It's kind of the same story here. Your external vendor is providing a API that is now part of a critical path on some piece of software. Some of these are better at it than others. Azure is super stable. OpenAI's commercial API, less so. And it's kind of an open secret that this thing just goes away for a couple hours, like routinely. Which if we're all in data science experimentation mode, not a big deal. You know, get some sunshine. It's probably good for you. For a business built on top of that, that's doing critical path things for flight reservations or who knows what else, going away for a couple of hours is not acceptable. So this movement towards can we run our own stuff in our own partitions is where a lot of that comes from. Now, the OpenAI models, I'm bagging on them. They've got a partnership with Microsoft. You can run ChatGPT in an Azure partition that is totally owned by you. That's cool. You can also run open models or whatever other machine learning you happen to be interested in your own infrastructure. But you're gonna have to manage those workloads, and managing workloads is a thing that we've got as an industry some track record with. Data science folks in general are not the people with that track record. It's the DevOps folks. And so there's gonna be a little bit of a culture clash between folks who are on the bleeding edge coming up with new models, and then the folks who have to operate those models, the ML ops piece of this. And so you want to start that conversation sooner rather than later. And like you do that with small tests, small prototypes, and then put them out there and try to like do things, but at a level of exposure that rewards your learning, right? Don't go live to the entire world right away. H, I saw you nodding. Anything to add?
Just totally in agreement with everything you said there.
Cool.
Super.
All right. Here's a list of mitigation patterns that we didn't really get into. If you want to screenshot this, you can go and Google these things. Like we didn't invent any of this stuff. It's kind of out there. But these mitigation patterns, I think, are going to be skills that product teams need to develop, and they're going to help you address and navigate all these things. Because we focus on some of the bad stuff, the harms, but we're very enthusiastic about this technology. I think it's going to be deep inside of lots of different software products, maybe not labeled AI, maybe not advertised as a AI service, but there's going to be lots of moments inside of software where you're transforming chunks of somewhat structured data into more structured data, you're classifying things, you're recognizing patterns that are emerging from flowing data. All these things are going to be really useful. They're not going to go away. So yeah. Kasia, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think be sure to take a screenshot of this if you haven't. It's actually super interesting, some of the stuff that's listed here. You know, when you look through some of these lists, like let's look at tooling, for example, and you see things like adversarial testing. I'm curious if anyone wants to come off mute or talk to us a little bit about like what comes to mind when you see some of the things that are listed here.
Yeah, this is the end of our canned content. So like we want to open up for questions and hopefully get some interaction going with folks in the audience. That's us.
I do have one question that goes back to the ethics portion of this presentation. And Jonathan, it's on your example, I guess, kind of the comic artist who has, you know, her work cloned and then a repository built on in the style of her work. How do you have any thoughts on the reverse scenario where the IP owner themselves would use these tools to kind of iterate on their own properties?
I think there is a path forward where artists are using this as a creative tool, right? And you're seeing writers and like various folks are sort of exploring that. I think the cultural moment is turning away from that a little bit, and you see people hardening into yes or no. And so that's unfortunate. I don't think it's inevitable. I think in the same way that AI becomes software over time, I think some of these creative tools will start becoming baked into workflows in a way that people don't really notice. So for example, is resizing an image AI? It's been inside of Photoshop for years and years. And like you make it bigger and then it runs out of pixels and then it starts getting fuzzy, right? Well, what if it didn't get fuzzy? What if it just got bigger? That seems pretty useful. And so I think there's going to be this blurry boundary between what is and isn't. And I'm hopeful that creative professionals get into a spot where they're feeling that their livelihoods are protected, such that they can explore and experiment and see really cool stuff. Because there are artists doing really amazing things with AI assistants. And those are valid art. They are like creative expressions. They are like deep and meaningful in the way that we expect art to be. It's absolutely a creative output. We've sort of solved that with like Duchamp and like the fountain. Little art history drop there. You can Google that one. Found art is the idea. Acacia, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the hope would be that they don't become so anti-AI artists, that is, or tainted by what's been done unethically, that they don't get to actually explore and interact with some of the benefits and how it can help them in their creative process to be more creative or to accomplish things more efficiently and what have you. I think sometimes if you're jaded or feel upset about any such entity, you're less likely to kind of engage with it and think about like the beauty that could come from it. So hopefully it gets to a space where, like Jonathan said, they feel protected and at the same time have an opportunity to explore and see some of the benefits of some of the cool tools and offerings that different AI tools have.
Awesome.
Right.
I have one more question actually for you guys if you want to answer it. It's not something we covered in this presentation, but there's a question regarding how would you get started building AI products when the AI function that's in your organization lives outside of product development? You know, maybe there's a team somewhere else, like a data team, and they're not that gap hasn't been bridged to product development. Do you have any tips on how to kind of unify those functions and connect one discipline to the other?
Acacia, do you want to talk about balanced teams a little bit?
Yeah, I was thinking a little bit about balance teams and also like drawing parallels between what that team that might feel distant from you is doing and the commonalities and what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think always thinking about a common goal is a great place to start there. We operate in terms of what are called balance teams, where we have product designers, product managers, and developers, and sometimes data scientists as well, on teams working together with shared goals, but all having ownership over particular areas of the process. And I think this is an opportunity to, again, get aligned behind the same idea of what it is that they're trying to accomplish with AI, perhaps, and think about how you might help them achieve that and help them to recognize that, like, you guys are in the same organization working toward common goals or objectives or missions that your company might have, and them getting to have an appreciation for what it is that you and your skill sets have to bring to the table. I think about this all the time in the work that I do day to day. I absolutely love working alongside product managers and developers, as opposed to handing off designs to developers and them having no insight into how I even came up with what it is that I came up with. So I think there's a lot of power in working together as a balanced team, and having a ton of transparency really does help folks to kind of rally behind the same idea and push the product forward, as we like to say, together. Anything to add there, Jonathan?
No, I think that covered it well. We have a white paper called Data Science and the Balanced Team, which is an attempt to describe this pattern. of how do we do cross-functional teams, particularly in the data science domain where the destination is not always clear, right? We know there's opportunity and there's a experimental aspect to that, which is different from typical software delivery. Even in our most agile organizations, we can usually guess at what the intended value of something is, right? We're starting with a problem that we're solving. At times in a data science world, you have this giant pool of data and you've got an opportunity space to like go and do things with it. That is not always clear who's going to benefit from it when you set out. And so we've got a paper that basically says, okay, how do we do real product development with actual rigor in that environment? That's there. We've also got a couple of other resources, so feel free to grab those links. Yeah, I think we are ready to wrap up. We are a little bit over time, but thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, guys.
I do want to just give a special thank you to you, Jonathan, to you, Acacia, and then Evan in the background for helping organize this webinar, for presenting at this webinar, and for answering all the great questions from the magnificent audience that were here today. Here live, this has been recorded, so if you're watching this in the future, hello, thank you for joining us. We hope that you guys can meet us at our future events, that you can answer questions live to us as we're presenting. So I do want to, again, just say a special thank you to the team. We hope everyone has a great week. This will be recorded and it will be available post-event. Have a great week, everybody.
Bye, everyone.